The father visits his wealthy daughter. But when he arrives, he discovers something horrifying.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Isabella would never do that to her father. She could never disappear so senselessly. Mr. Edward muttered, his old eyes fixed intently on a photo of his only daughter, Isabella. It was a picture he had taken 4 years ago, before she married Frederick, a successful businessman living in a lavish mansion in the city. For 3 years, there had been no letters, no phone calls. Mr. Edward, the proud father of Isabella, began to feel that something was amiss. Vague dreams and urgent calls he couldn't explain seemed to urge him to take action. He decided to leave the quiet, peaceful village, for the first time in over a decade, to search for the answers to his doubts and unease. Arriving in the city, Mr. Edward was astonished by its bustling energy. The chaotic traffic and dazzling lights made him feel lost. It was a world that had changed drastically. With an old suitcase in hand, he asked for directions to his daughter's mansion. A taxi driver named James looked at him through the rearview mirror and subtly shook his head when he heard Frederick's name. "Are you sure you want to go there?" James asked, lowering his voice. "Why not?" "That's my daughter Isabella's home," Mr. Edward replied, his eyes glimmering with hope. James said no more, just shrugged. But the serious look on his face filled Mr. Edward with unease. When the large iron gates of the mansion opened, Mr. Edward was stunned by the grandeur of the house. However, when he knocked on the door, it was answered by a young woman he had never seen before. She was dressed in an expensive gown, her cold eyes scanning him from head to toe. "Who are you?" she asked sharply. "I'm Isabella's father. I've come to visit my daughter." She appeared momentarily flustered but quickly replaced it with a polite smile. "Isabella? She moved out. Frederick and I currently live here." Mr. Edward felt the blood rush to his face. "Moved out? Where? Why didn't she tell me?" "I'm not sure. But Frederick can answer your questions when he returns." "I'm sorry, but I'm busy." She shut the door in his face. "Wait. What's your name?" Mr. Edward called out. "I'm Lydia, Frederick's wife," she replied, the words hitting him like a dagger. Unwilling to accept Lydia's superficial explanation, Mr. Edward resolved to stay in the city to investigate further. He rented a small room near the mansion and began asking around about Isabella. But those who worked in the vicinity of the mansion avoided talking whenever her name was mentioned. One day, however, he happened upon Matthew, an older gardener trimming the bushes near the mansion's fence. "Hello, sir. Do you know Isabella?" Mr. Edward asked in a low, hopeful voice. Matthew looked up, his cloudy eyes filled with caution. "I know her. But you should be careful. This place is not like your village, Mr. Edward." "Why? What happened to my daughter?" Matthew shook his head and resumed his work, leaving behind a cryptic warning. "Find out for yourself, but Mr. Edward trusts Frederick too much." Mr. Edward's suspicions deepened as he observed more oddities surrounding the mansion. Isabella's presence seemed entirely erased from the house. Even the old servants who used to work for Isabella were no longer there. Lydia controlled everything in the household with an iron grip, and anyone who mentioned Isabella was either reprimanded or fired on the spot. James, the taxi driver who had driven Mr. Edward, managed to track him down at his boarding house. One evening, he unexpectedly showed up. "Mr. Edward, I don't know if you want to hear this, but I overheard some locals saying that Isabella might still be in the mansion." Mr. Edward shot to his feet. "Are you sure? What did they say?" James nodded, his expression serious. "Some say she's being kept inside, but I can't confirm it. If you want, I'll help you. But this won't be easy. Frederick is a powerful man." Mr. Edward grabbed James by the shoulders. "I'm not afraid. I just need to save my daughter." James was silent for a moment before nodding. "All right, but you need to be cautious. I'll try to speak with Matthew again. He knows more than he's willing to admit. That night, Mr. Edward couldn't sleep. Memories of Isabella flooded his mind, her cheerful smile by the river, her shining eyes whenever she shared her academic achievements, and her promise before getting married that she would always remember her father. "No, Isabella. I won't let you suffer," he muttered, clutching the old photograph tightly. In the darkness of his small boarding room, Mr. Edward devised a plan. He knew that to save Isabella, he would have to risk everything. He was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his daughter from harm, no matter the cost. The following morning, Mr. Edward decided to approach Matthew again. Despite Matthew's warnings, he was convinced that the gardener knew something critical. Matthew was tending to the flower beds near the fence when Mr. Edward arrived. "Matthew, I need to talk to you." "This is about Isabella, my daughter," Mr. Edward said, his voice resolute. Matthew looked up, his rough hands pausing mid-motion. "I've already told you, Mr. Edward. Asking too many questions will only bring trouble, for both you and me. I'm not afraid of trouble. Where is my daughter? Someone told me she's still in the mansion. Please, tell me the truth." Mr. Edward stepped closer, his old yet piercing eyes filled with determination. Matthew sighed, glancing around the garden to ensure no one was listening. "All right. But you must promise me not to tell anyone that I told you this." Mr. Edward nodded immediately. "I promise. Just tell me." Lowering his voice, Matthew spoke, his eyes filled with worry. "Isabella never left the mansion. She's being kept in the basement, in a locked room. Ever since Frederick married Lydia, everything changed. Lydia took control of everything, and Isabella became a thorn in their side." Mr. Edward felt the world spinning around him, darkness closing in. "Imprisoned? Why? Why would they do this to my daughter?" "I don't know the exact reasons, but I've heard that Isabella opposed Frederick handing over the company to Lydia. Since then, she became a threat to them." Matthew paused, his expression somber. "But I've also heard that Isabella's situation isn't just about being imprisoned. She's growing weaker by the day." "Weaker? What do you mean?" Mr. Edward gripped Matthew's arm tightly, his voice trembling. "I'm not sure. But some say they're poisoning her." Matthew's words hit Mr. Edward like a punch to the gut. His blood boiled with anger. "We have to do something. I can't stand by and watch Isabella suffer. Do you think I don't want to help? But Frederick is dangerous, and Lydia is cunning. And me? I'm just a gardener, Mr. Edward. I can't stand against them," Matthew replied, his voice filled with helplessness. "But I'm Isabella's father. I can't just sit and do nothing while my daughter is in danger," Mr. Edward declared resolutely. Matthew was silent for a long moment, then said quietly. "If you really want to help Isabella, there's someone you should meet, Sophia, Isabella's private doctor. I don't know if she'll be willing to help, but she's the only one who can tell you about Isabella's real condition." "Where is Sophia? How can I meet her?" Mr. Edward asked urgently. "She usually comes to the mansion in the afternoons. I'll try to arrange for you to meet her secretly. But be careful, Mr. Edward. If Frederick finds out, you'll be in danger." That afternoon, Mr. Edward waited in a secluded corner of the garden as Matthew had instructed. When the back door of the mansion opened, a slender woman stepped out. Her delicate face was marked by visible anxiety. Matthew signaled her, and Sophia hesitantly approached them. "Sophia, this is Mr. Edward, Isabella's father. He needs your help," Matthew introduced. Sophia looked at Mr. Edward with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Edward, but I can't say much. If they find out I've shared information, I'll lose my job, or worse, my life. Please, I just want to save my daughter. I know you understand Isabella's condition better than anyone. Tell me, what has happened to her? How is she now?" Mr. Edward pleaded. Sophia lowered her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. Isabella is being poisoned. I discovered the signs through tests, but Lydia won't allow me to take her to a hospital. I can't do much except provide temporary treatments to ease her pain. Mr. Edward gritted his teeth, his hands trembling with rage. Do you have proof? Is there a way to show they're harming Isabella? I've kept some samples of the medication they've been forcing on Isabella. If you want, I can help you send them for testing. But it will take time and must be done discreetly. Do it as quickly as you can. I'll help in any way you need. As long as we can save Isabella, I'll face any danger, Mr. Edward said, his eyes burning with determination. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Sophia quickly stepped back. I must go. If anything changes, I'll inform Matthew. But you must be extremely careful, Mr. Edward. They are not as simple as you might think. Sophia hurried away, leaving Mr. Edward with a flood of questions and fears. He turned to Matthew, who was trying to stay calm. We need a plan. I won't let my daughter remain in their hands, Mr. Edward said, his voice low but firm. Matthew nodded, though his face betrayed his worry. I'll do what I can, but we need to prepare carefully. Don't rush. Time isn't on our side, Matthew. I won't let Isabella wait another day, Mr. Edward replied. Inside Mr. Edward's heart, a fire of anger burned fiercer than ever. No matter the power or cruelty he faced, he knew he had no choice but to save Isabella at any cost. That night, Mr. Edward sat alone in his cramped boarding room. Sophia and Matthew's words echoed in his mind. Isabella is being poisoned. His heart clenched, each beat a reminder that he needed to act immediately. A knock at the door startled him. He quickly stood and opened it to find Matthew, his face tense. Frederick has planned to attend a grand party tomorrow, taking Lydia with him. This is our only chance. If you want to get Isabella out, we must act now. Thank you, Matthew. But what about the security team at the mansion? Mr. Edward asked, his voice steady but resolute. There aren't many of them, and I know some routes that are less guarded. But it's still very risky. Mr. Edward nodded. Risk? He didn't care. All he could think about was Isabella, his beloved daughter, enduring pain and darkness. The next day, Matthew quietly led Mr. Edward to the back of the mansion, where a basement entrance was hidden by a large bush. It was a small steel door with an electronic lock. Matthew glanced around before pulling a keycard from his pocket. I borrowed this from a security guard. It'll get us inside. But we must move quickly before anyone notices. Are you certain Isabella is down there? Mr. Edward asked, his voice low, his eyes unwavering. I'm not 100% sure, but it's the only place locked this tightly, and no one is allowed in except Frederick and Lydia. Matthew swiped the card through the scanner, and the steel door unlocked with a soft click. A rush of cold air escaped from the basement, carrying a musty smell and an oppressive atmosphere. Mr. Edward clenched his fists and followed Matthew inside. The basement was pitch dark, lit only by dim lights hanging from the ceiling. Every step echoed on the cold tiles, sending a chill through both men. Matthew whispered, pointing to the end of the hallway. The room is down there. But we must be careful. I don't know if anyone is inside. They moved closer to the door. Another steel door barred their way, but this time it had a traditional lock. Matthew pulled out a small key from his pocket. This is a maintenance key. I hope it works. Matthew inserted the key and turned it. A soft click echoed, and the door slowly creaked open. The room beyond was pitch black, but the faint light from the hallway was enough for Mr. Edward to see Isabella. She was sitting on a small bed, her body frail and pale to the point that Mr. Edward almost didn't recognize her. Her eyes were closed, her face hollow, and bruises dotted her arms. Mr. Edward's heart shattered. Isabella. My daughter. Mr. Edward rushed to the bedside, grabbing Isabella's icy hands. She opened her eyes weakly, her cloudy gaze struggling to focus. A faint voice escaped her dry lips. Father. Is it you? Yes, it's me. I've come to save you. You won't stay here another minute. Mr. Edward said, his voice breaking with emotion. Matthew stepped in, placing a hand on Mr. Edward's shoulder. We have to get her out now. Frederick could return at any moment. They helped Isabella out of the room, but halfway down the hallway, a noise froze all three in place. Someone was coming. Matthew quickly pulled Mr. Edward and Isabella into a dark corner. Stay quiet. Matthew whispered, pressing a hand over Mr. Edward's mouth. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed closer, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight sweeping the hallway. A security guard was patrolling. Mr. Edward held his breath, clutching Isabella tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. The guard stopped right outside the room they had just left. He opened the door, peeked inside, and mumbled something under his breath before closing it again. The footsteps gradually faded, and the flashlight disappeared. Matthew exhaled deeply. Move quickly. This is our only chance. They reached the steel door, but when Matthew swiped the keycard to unlock it, the system flashed an error. It won't open. Matthew muttered, sweat dripping down his forehead. What's happening? Mr. Edward asked, his voice filled with worry. I don't know. Maybe they changed the code. Let me try again. Matthew swiped the card once more, but the system remained unresponsive. Meanwhile, the sound of footsteps began approaching again. This time, there were two sets. Mr. Edward felt the tension mounting with every passing second. We're out of time. Is there another way out? Mr. Edward asked urgently. Matthew shook his head. There's no other exit. If we can't open this door, we'll be caught. Mr. Edward scanned the area, his eyes darting to every corner of the basement. In a split second, he noticed a small ventilation duct on the wall nearby. We can escape through there. Matthew followed his gaze. That vent leads outside, but it's very narrow. Isabella can crawl through, but we'll need to remove the grate. Matthew and Mr. Edward worked together, using all their strength to pry the metal grate off the vent. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and cold sweat dripped down their faces. Finally, the grate came loose. Matthew helped Isabella crawl into the vent, but just as she entered, the steel door behind them creaked open. A flashlight beam shone directly at them, and a voice shouted. Stop right there. Mr. Edward and Matthew turned to face two security guards rushing toward them, weapons at the ready. Mr. Edward positioned himself in front of the vent, yelling. Isabella, keep going. Don't stop. Freeze. You're not allowed to be here, one of the guards barked, the blinding flashlight beam trained on Mr. Edward and Matthew. The guards moved closer with aggressive stances, their hands hovering near their holstered guns. Mr. Edward stood firm, blocking the vent where Isabella was crawling through. His voice rang out with defiance. You will not harm my daughter. One of the guards sneered. Your daughter. This is Frederick's business. You have no right to interfere. Step aside now if you don't want trouble. Matthew quickly stepped forward, trying to de-escalate the situation. Gentlemen, we're just here to collect some belongings. We mean no harm or disruption. The second guard raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with suspicion. Belongings? There's nothing here that belongs to you. Back off, or we'll report this to the boss. In that moment, Mr. Edward realized there was no turning back. If they were caught now, their only chance to save Isabella would be lost forever. Matthew, take care of Isabella. Mr. Edward shouted, then charged at one of the guards, knocking him off balance and sending him to the ground. The second guard, stunned, reached for his gun, but Matthew quickly grabbed his arm and twisted it, forcing the weapon to drop. Chaos erupted. Mr. Edward, despite his age and frailty, used every ounce of strength he had to hold down the struggling guard beneath him. The other guard wrestled with Matthew, who was desperately trying to keep him away from the vent. Meanwhile, Isabella was still crawling through the narrow vent. The tight space made her progress slow and arduous, but she pressed on, determined. Each shout from behind sent a jolt of fear through her heart as she worried for her father and Matthew. "Father, you have to hold on. Don't give up," Isabella whispered, tears streaming down her gaunt face. At the far end of the vent, a faint noise startled her. The dim light from the exit revealed that freedom was near. She mustered all her remaining strength, crawling a few more feet until she finally felt the cold air outside against her face. Isabella slid out of the vent, collapsing onto the damp grass outside the mansion. She lay there, gasping for breath, her body exhausted. But there was no time to rest. She looked up, searching desperately for her father. Inside the basement, Matthew was slammed against the wall by one of the guards. The sounds of shouting and scuffling filled the air. Mr. Edward, though utterly drained, held tightly to the other guard to block his path. The guard punched him hard in the shoulder, but he refused to let go. "Old man, let go, or I'll," the guard shouted, but his words were cut off as Matthew grabbed a dropped flashlight and struck the guard hard on the back of the head, knocking him unconscious. "Quick, Mr. Edward. We have to get out of here now," Matthew yelled, pulling Mr. Edward to his feet. They ran toward the vent, but realized it was too late to crawl through. The sound of more footsteps approaching signaled reinforcements. "You go on. Leave me behind," Mr. Edward said firmly. "No. I'm not leaving you." Matthew shot back, but his eyes gleamed with an idea. "There's another way out through the storage room. Follow me." Matthew led Mr. Edward down the hallway, away from the vent. The pursuing guard's footsteps grew louder, but Matthew seemed to know the basement's every twist and turn. They reached an old wooden door, and Matthew quickly unlocked it. "This leads to the back of the mansion. But we have to move quickly, no one can see us," Matthew said, panting. They rushed through a narrow passage lit by dim, flickering bulbs. At the end of the corridor, Matthew pushed open a small door, and they stepped out into the night. The moonlight bathed the garden in a soft glow, offering a brief moment of solace. "Isabella!" Mr. Edward called out loudly, but Matthew quickly covered his mouth. "Be quiet. They might hear us." In the distance, Isabella heard her father's voice. She staggered to her feet, moving toward the sound. When she finally saw Mr. Edward's figure, she burst into tears and ran toward him with every bit of strength she had left. "Father!" "Isabella!" Mr. Edward rushed to embrace his daughter tightly. Both father and daughter wept in each other's arms, but they couldn't stay there for long. Matthew kept watch, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We need to leave now." They could already be on their way. The three of them moved through the garden, staying far from the lights of the mansion. Matthew led the way, searching for a way out through a small gate at the back. As they approached, an alarm blared, tearing through the quiet night. "Run!" Matthew shouted, urging Mr. Edward and Isabella forward. The alarm quickly drew attention from the mansion, and beams of light from flashlights began sweeping the area. Isabella was nearly out of energy, so Mr. Edward carried her on his back, his aging legs straining to run as fast as possible. He couldn't bear to lose his daughter again. When they reached the gate, Matthew used a key to try to unlock it, but it didn't work. "Damn it! They've locked it from the inside," Matthew hissed, banging on the iron gate in frustration. Footsteps and barking dogs echoed from behind. "We'll have to climb," Matthew shouted. Mr. Edward and Matthew helped Isabella climb over the gate, but just as Mr. Edwards started to climb, a flashlight beam from the mansion illuminated them. There they are. Stop them, a voice yelled, followed by the sound of gunfire. Mr. Edward managed to climb through just in time, and the three of them bolted into the darkness of the nearby forest, the shouts and gunfire still echoing behind them. The forest's thick darkness enveloped them like a shroud, swallowing all traces of light from the distant mansion. Mr. Edward panted heavily, his exhausted legs trembling but still pushing forward to put as much distance as possible between them and their pursuers. Matthew supported Isabella, her half-closed eyes struggling to stay focused on reality. "We have to go deeper into the forest, as far from the mansion as possible," Matthew said quietly, his tone urgent yet firm. "But Isabella, she can't go much farther." Mr. Edward looked at his daughter, his heart clenching at the sight of her pale face and labored breathing. Matthew nodded, scanning the area. "I know there's a small ranger's cabin nearby. If we're lucky, we can take shelter there." Mr. Edward had no other option. "Lead the way. We must save her." The sound of barking dogs grew louder, closing in on them. Flashlight beams flickered through the trees, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of their pursuers. "They're getting closer. Hurry!" Matthew urged, helping Isabella move faster. Mr. Edward glanced back. In the flickering light, he could make out the silhouettes of men moving through the trees, guns in hand. His heart sank. He couldn't let them take Isabella again. "Matthew, let me carry Isabella. You run ahead and lead the way," Mr. Edward said, his eyes blazing with determination. Matthew hesitated but realized there was no time to argue. He helped Isabella onto Mr. Edward's back. Though frail, Mr. Edward summoned every ounce of his remaining strength to carry his daughter on his shoulders. "Hold on tight, Isabella. I won't let anything happen to you," he whispered, his voice trembling but filled with resolve. Matthew led them through rugged paths, where branches and bushes seemed intent on tripping them. The dogs' barking was right behind them, and the shouts from their pursuers made the air feel suffocating. "Don't let them escape. They can't have gone far." The shout felt like a challenge, fueling Mr. Edward's determination. Though his legs ached and his body screamed in pain, he kept moving forward. Each step was a silent vow that he would protect Isabella at all costs. Finally, Matthew pointed ahead. "There it is. The ranger's cabin." A small wooden house appeared in the darkness, hidden among the tall trees. The faint moonlight cast eerie shadows on its old roof, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Matthew ran ahead and pushed open the creaky door. "Get inside, quickly," he said, his voice urgent but hushed. Mr. Edward hurried inside and gently placed Isabella on an old wooden chair. She let out a faint groan, her eyes closing. He knelt beside her, checking her breathing with deep concern. "Isabella, stay strong. You're going to be all right. I promise I'll protect you, no matter what," he whispered, gripping her hand tightly. Matthew shut the door and barricaded it with a wooden plank. "They won't take long to get here. We need another plan." Mr. Edward nodded, but exhaustion clouded his thoughts. He looked around the small cabin. Besides a wooden table, a few chairs, and an old oil lamp, there was nothing useful. "I'll go out and distract them," Matthew said suddenly, his eyes gleaming with determination. "No. You can't do that. If they catch you, they'll kill you." Mr. Edward protested, his voice filled with worry. "If I don't, they'll find all three of us. Don't worry, I know how to slip away. Stay here and take care of Isabella. She needs you more than anything." Mr. Edward wanted to stop him, but Matthew opened the door before he could say another word. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving an eerie silence in the cabin. The barking grew louder, closer this time. Mr. Edward pulled Isabella closer, shielding her from any threat. He listened intently to every sound outside, his eyes never leaving the door. We'll get through this, Isabella. I promise, he whispered, his voice shaking. Suddenly, a loud pounding came from the door. Open up. We know you're in there, a commanding voice boomed from outside. Mr. Edward didn't respond, holding his breath. He clutched Isabella tightly, as if letting go would mean losing everything. The pounding continued, growing more forceful. If you don't open up, we'll break the door down. Rage flared within Mr. Edward. He couldn't let them harm Isabella again. He stood up and grabbed a wooden stick nearby, his eyes burning with determination. A loud crash echoed as the door burst open. 2 security guards stormed in, their guns aimed directly at Mr. Edward. Don't move. Stay where you are, one of them shouted. Mr. Edward raised the stick high, ready to defend his daughter with everything he had. You will not touch my daughter, he roared. You think you can do anything with a stick? One of the guards sneered, taking another step forward. But before he could act, a shout rang out from behind. Matthew appeared, charging straight at the other guard and knocking him down. A gunshot echoed, but the bullet only struck the wooden wall. Chaos erupted again, and this time, Mr. Edward didn't hesitate. He swung the stick with all his might, aiming directly at the guard advancing toward Isabella. Though his strength was waning, his determination to protect his daughter made him stronger than ever. The wooden stick struck the security guard's hand as he raised his gun. He screamed in pain, dropping the weapon to the floor with a metallic clang. Matthew quickly lunged for the gun, picked it up, and pointed it at the other guard. Back off. Or I'll shoot. Matthew shouted, his hands trembling but his gaze resolute. The remaining guard looked between Matthew and his partner writhing on the ground, then back at the gun aimed squarely at his chest. He growled but eventually raised his hands in surrender, deciding not to risk his life. Drop your weapon and leave. Matthew ordered, his voice firm. The guard grabbed his partner's fallen gun, placed it carefully on the floor, and began backing out of the cabin. You won't get away with this. Frederick will find you, he hissed. Matthew didn't respond. He waited until the guard had stepped outside, then slammed the door shut and secured it with the wooden bar. Turning to Mr. Edward, he said. We don't have much time. They'll call for reinforcements. We need to get Isabella out of here now. Isabella lay motionless on the old chair, her breathing shallow. Mr. Edward knelt beside her, his face etched with worry. Isabella, you have to hold on. I won't let them hurt you again. Isabella weakly opened her eyes, her voice so faint it was barely audible. Father, don't leave me. I will never leave you. You are everything to me, Mr. Edward replied, his voice breaking with emotion. Matthew approached, his expression filled with concern. There's a trail behind this cabin that leads out of the forest. I'll guide you both, but we need to move quickly. Are you sure it's safe? Mr. Edward asked, his eyes pleading with hope. Nothing is certain. But if we don't go now, they'll find us, and it'll all be over. Matthew and Mr. Edward carefully helped Isabella to her feet and guided her out of the cabin. Outside, the distant sound of barking dogs and flashing lights indicated their pursuers were still searching. They quickly entered the trail, doing their best to remain silent. The dense forest surrounded them, with the rustling wind in the leaves and the snapping of dry branches beneath their feet. Mr. Edward supported Isabella while trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't afford to let fear consume him. If he could get Isabella out of this, everything would be all right. Matthew led the way, constantly scanning the surroundings to ensure they weren't being followed. But soon, the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, heavier, and closer. They're catching up. Matthew whispered, his face tense. We need to run. Without hesitation, Mr. Edward lifted Isabella into his arms and began running, summoning every ounce of strength left in his body. Every step sent pain shooting through his legs, but he didn't stop. Isabella, light as a dry twig, rested weakly in his arms, her eyes half closed. She whispered faintly. "Father. I'm sorry." "No, my dear, you have nothing to apologize for. It's those wicked people who are to blame." "I will get you out of here," Mr. Edward replied, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. Matthew ran alongside them, constantly glancing back. "They've seen us. Hurry." Shouts echoed behind them, and beams of flashlight began cutting through the trees nearby. A gunshot rang out, making all three of them flinch. Matthew turned around and fired a warning shot with the gun he had taken. The loud crack of the shot echoed through the still forest night, causing their pursuers to momentarily halt. "Go. I'll hold them off," Matthew shouted, his eyes fixed on Mr. Edward. "No. I won't leave you behind," Mr. Edward immediately protested. "Don't be stubborn. You need to get Isabella out of here. If you don't, everything we've done will be for nothing." Matthew yelled back, firing another shot to force the pursuers into cover. With no other choice, Mr. Edward clenched his jaw and gave Matthew one last look. "Thank you, for everything." Matthew didn't reply, only nodded before turning back to face the approaching enemies. Mr. Edward carried Isabella and continued running, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The trail led to a gentle slope where faint moonlight filtered through the trees. They were close, just a little further. Behind them, gunshots and Matthew's shouts mixed with the frenzied barking of the dogs. Mr. Edward silently prayed for Matthew's safety. He was a good man. Finally, the trail opened into a clearing at the forest's edge. In the dim light, Mr. Edward saw an old truck parked nearby. Standing beside it was James, the taxi driver who had helped him before. "Mr. Edward. Over here." James shouted, running toward them to help with Isabella. "James, you're just in time," Mr. Edward panted, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. "Where's Matthew?" James asked, his voice filled with worry. Mr. Edward shook his head. "He stayed behind to hold them off. We need to leave now." James lifted Isabella into the truck as Mr. Edward climbed in after her. The engine roared to life, and the truck sped down the dirt road, away from the forest. Behind them, the barking dogs and flashlight beams faded into the distance. Inside the truck, Mr. Edward held Isabella's hand tightly. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You're safe now, Isabella. I promise, no one will hurt you again." James glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "We'll take her to Dr. Sophia. She'll know how to take care of her." Mr. Edward nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. The fight wasn't over, but he had reclaimed hope for his daughter. The truck sped along the bumpy dirt road, leaving the dark forest behind. Inside the cabin, Mr. Edward kept a firm hold on Isabella's frail hand, his eyes never leaving her pale face. James drove quickly, his expression tense as he frequently checked the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. "James, thank you so much. Without you, I don't know how I could have gotten Isabella out," Mr. Edward said, his voice hoarse with emotion. James glanced back briefly, offering a faint smile. "Don't thank me, Mr. Edward. This is the least I could do. Isabella didn't deserve what she went through." The atmosphere in the car was safe but tense. Mr. Edward couldn't stop thinking about Matthew. The image of the brave man who decided to stay behind to hold off the pursuers haunted him deeply. "Matthew, he'll be okay, won't he?" Mr. Edward whispered, his eyes red with emotion. James took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "Matthew is very smart. If anyone can escape them, it's him. You have to trust him." As the car approached the town, James quickly changed direction, avoiding main roads to ensure they wouldn't be spotted. Eventually, they stopped in front of a small house hidden among a residential area. Sophia, Isabella's private doctor, was already waiting. When James carried Isabella into the house, Sophia immediately took her to the bed and began examining her condition. "I'll do everything I can to help Isabella recover," Sophia said firmly. Night fell, but Mr. Edward couldn't rest. He sat by Isabella's bedside, holding her hand and praying. In his heart, a flame of hope burned brightly, but the worry about Matthew wouldn't let him find peace. Around dawn, a knock on the door echoed through the quiet house. James immediately went to check, and he was stunned to see Matthew standing there. His shirt was torn, his face smeared with dirt, but his eyes still burned with determination. "Matthew!" James exclaimed, throwing the door open. Hearing the commotion, Mr. Edward rushed out. When he saw Matthew, he could hardly believe his eyes. He stepped forward and embraced the brave man who had helped save Isabella. "You're back. You're safe," Mr. Edward said, his voice trembling. Matthew gave a weary smile. "I promised to help you, Mr. Edward. But now, we must finish what we started. Frederick and Lydia must pay." After a thorough examination, Sophia reported that Isabella would need time to fully recover. The poisons Lydia had used to torment her had not caused long-term damage, provided she received timely treatment. This news gave Mr. Edward some relief, but he knew the battle wasn't over yet. Matthew and James spent the following days gathering evidence. With Sophia's help, they sent samples of the poison to a lab for analysis. The results confirmed that the substances had been intentionally used to weaken Isabella's body. Mr. Edward decided to report the entire incident to the police, along with the compelling evidence they had gathered. During this time, Isabella began to recover under Sophia's dedicated care. She ate more, her eyes regained their brightness, and her voice grew stronger. One morning, as Mr. Edward sat by her bed, Isabella gently held his hand. "Father. I'm sorry for making you worry," she said softly but sincerely. Mr. Edward smiled, tears streaming down his face. "No, my dear. You have nothing to apologize for. I'll always be here to protect you. Just focus on getting better." Meanwhile, Matthew and James informed Mr. Edward that the police had started investigating Frederick's mansion. A surprise raid uncovered numerous documents proving that Frederick and Lydia had committed several crimes, including money laundering and the abuse of Isabella. The day Frederick and Lydia were arrested, Mr. Edward felt as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But he didn't stop there. With Matthew's help, he organized a press conference to reveal the full truth about what Isabella had endured. Her story shocked the public, sparking outrage over the cruelty of Frederick and Lydia. Frederick and Lydia were sentenced to many years in prison. The court ordered Frederick to compensate for all the assets he had stolen from Isabella. Lydia, the mastermind of the heinous acts, faced a harsher sentence for her crimes of poisoning and unlawfully imprisoning Isabella. After many exhausting days, Isabella sat on a chair on the porch, her gaze fixed on the sunlit garden. She had recovered physically and emotionally, but the memories of her captivity remained, like a scar that would never fully heal. However, she refused to let that pain hold her back. Instead, she chose to focus on those who had saved her, those who had risked everything to bring her out of that hell. One beautiful morning, Isabella invited all the most important people in her life to breakfast. Mr. Edward, her father, an unwavering pillar of support; Matthew, the courageous gardener who had risked his life to save her; James, the kind-hearted taxi driver who had always been there at the right moment; and Sophia, the dedicated doctor who had preserved her life. When everyone had gathered around the table, Isabella stood up, her voice trembling but filled with emotion. "I know no words can fully express the gratitude I feel for all of you. But today, I want to say it aloud. Without you, I wouldn't be sitting here, healthy and full of hope like I am now." Isabella turned to her father, who was listening intently. "Father, you are the greatest hero of my life. You pushed past your age, your strength, and even risked your own life to save me. I know you endured so much pain and worry, but you never gave up. I promise you, from this day forward, I will live a life that makes you proud." Mr. Edward smiled, his eyes brimming with tears. He said nothing, simply holding Isabella's hand tightly. Isabella then turned to Matthew, who was quietly sitting at the corner of the table. "Matthew, you risked your life to get me out of that place. Without you, I don't know what would have happened to me. I will always remember your courage and kindness. I hope you will always see me as family." Matthew smiled and gave a small nod. "Miss Isabella, I only did what I believed was right. I'm just glad you're safe and recovering." Next, Isabella approached James and took his hand. "James, you showed up just when my father and I needed help the most. You're not just a friend, you're a hero in my story. Thank you for everything." James, as humble as ever, smiled softly. "Isabella, there's no need to thank me. I did it because I knew you were someone worth protecting." Finally, Isabella turned to Sophia. "Sophia, without your care, I wouldn't be standing here today. You didn't just save my life, you gave me hope. I owe you so much." Sophia nodded gently, her eyes shining with emotion. "Isabella, I only did what a doctor is meant to do. Seeing you recover makes it all worthwhile." That morning passed in warmth and love. Isabella felt as though she had been blessed with a second family, people who were not bound to her by blood but who had loved and protected her as if she were one of their own. A year later, Isabella stood on stage at a major business conference. From a woman once imprisoned and poisoned, she had risen above her struggles to become a successful entrepreneur. Her company, Estrella de Esperanza, Star of Hope, focused on supporting abused women and orphan children. In her speech, Isabella did not forget to honor the people who had helped her reach this point. "Every step I take carries the imprint of those I love. My father, Mr. Edward, taught me that love and determination can overcome any obstacle. Matthew, the humble but courageous gardener, showed me the strength of loyalty. James, the kind-hearted taxi driver, proved that small acts of kindness can change a life. And Sophia, the dedicated doctor, reminded me that compassion can save not just a life but a soul." After her speech, Isabella returned home to find Mr. Edward sitting in the garden, reading an old book. She approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Father, I will never forget what you did for me. I want you to know that my life, from now until forever, will be dedicated to repaying the love and sacrifices you've made for me." Mr. Edward smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "My dear daughter, I don't need you to repay me. Seeing you happy and strong is the greatest gift I could ever receive." In the months that followed, Isabella worked tirelessly to grow her company. Matthew became her property manager, bringing his meticulous understanding and unwavering loyalty to the role. James was invited to serve as the company's security consultant, ensuring that none of them would ever face danger again. Sophia, in addition to her work as a doctor, became the director of a health program for women sponsored by Isabella's company. Every week, Isabella reserved a day to spend with Mr. Edward. They would walk together, talk, and reminisce about the difficult times they had overcome. To Isabella, her father's presence was her greatest source of strength, a constant reminder of the love and sacrifice that had brought her to where she was. At the 2-year anniversary celebration of her company's founding, Isabella raised a glass to toast those who had saved her life. "Today, I want to take this moment to thank the people who saved my life. My father, Matthew, James, and Sophia, each of you has shown me that nothing is stronger than love and compassion. I promise to continue spreading these values to every corner our company touches." Applause filled the room, but in Isabella's heart, one voice rang louder than all the others, her father's. "My daughter, always live with strength and kindness, as I have seen you do today." Isabella's story is a profound lesson in love, courage, and solidarity. It reminds us that the strength of family and genuine companions can overcome any challenge, no matter how insurmountable it seems. Isabella proved that from suffering and injustice, one can rise, find meaning in life, and create value for the community. Above all, gratitude and giving back are the ways to preserve and spread love, turning pain into lasting hope and happiness.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.